Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today we're going to be doing a series Who's Nintendo Suing This Week and Why Are They Suing Them? And interestingly enough, we actually don't have a new Nintendo lawsuit to report on, but at an event in Japan, Nintendo said the quiet part out loud and basically admitted to the fact that emulation is illegal. Now they put a ton of different qualifiers on that statement, a lot of which could be debated legally, but it's a really interesting look into Nintendo's thought process, and it explains a lot of what they're doing right now with different emulation lawsuits. And it basically is exactly what I said was going to happen and what was going to happen moving forward, and the protection of the Nintendo Switch 2, which they just announced in a trailer 48 hours ago compared to when I'm doing this voiceover. And it is very interesting information because we've gone through the entire litany of lawsuits. We had Yuzu, we had Ryujinx, we had basically every single Nintendo Switch emulator out there sued or at least removed in some way, shape, or form, and they've all either ended up with private deals in the background or settlements that didn't go before a judge whatsoever. And even though this would be civil court, the fact that Nintendo doesn't actually try to sue anyone who would fight back is very important. And that is definitely the crux of this argument here. They have admitted that emulation is legal, but they talk about the fact that you're not able to circumvent their technological prevention measures, or TPMs. That's what Nintendo has been hanging their hat on in this entire legal argument, and that is where the DMCA as well as other countries' laws really do get confusing, and why Nintendo probably doesn't want to see a court case, because they could as easily lose this as they could win. It's down to the fact that the DMCA, or Digital Millennium Copyright Act, was in fact written at the turn of the millennium, has some very vague language, and basically tells you not to do something in one paragraph and then tells you can absolutely do that thing in the next paragraph. And because Yuzu and Ryujinx never went to court, they were all privately settled, this is how Nintendo picks these things off, because if they see the inside of a courtroom, it is possible that they could lose. And again, Nintendo saying emulation is illegal is the quiet part out loud, because they've been spending so much time telling their customers on the website that emulation is only for illegal purposes and there is no upside benefit to it, which is absolutely a blatant lie, and that's what Nintendo wants you to think. Using about 7 seconds of emulation footage here, hopefully I don't make them too angry about it, because I own a Nintendo DS, I own a copy of Super Mario 64 on there, I can do whatever I want with it. And interestingly, Nintendo only seems to go after the current generation of stuff, including 3DS, which is a little bit older than obviously the Switch, but I think Nintendo still considers it current gen. But Switch emulation they go after with a sledgehammer, and it's all down to the fact that Switch 2 is going to be able to handle all of the Switch games and is derivative hardware. So when you think about why they're going after this so hard, I can almost guarantee you within probably 3 to 6 months of the Switch 2's launch, you will see evidence of a Switch 2 game actually emulating on something like your PC. But emulation is very valuable. Playing something like Castlevania here on my 65-inch OLED television in my living room, being able to actually interact with it with a mouse cursor, is just a different way to play a game I love. And because I own all of the hardware and I own all of the software, I am legally permitted to use that however I want. That is proven case law at this point in time, and unless there is a court case that basically changes that precedent, it is something that we can just point to. But at the Tokyo Esports Festa, some different members of different companies, including Sega, Capcom, Konami, and Nintendo, discussed different concerns within their game industry. This feels more like an industry event where Nintendo's representative basically said something that Nintendo proper, their PR and marketing divisions, would not say, and that is talking about whether or not emulation is legal. They also go into different flashcards and pirated games, and again, you should not be pirating the games. That is not good for any company. It is never anything I would ever advocate for on the channel whatsoever. It is just not a good time, and it's going to lead these people and emulation creators getting into issues if they do it. But they talk to all of these different managing directors, partners, whatever titles they have, about the different concerns and things they're going through in their industry, basically just getting contemporaries in the same room to discuss matters that are important to them. And one of the topics that came up are emulators legal or illegal, and the representative from Nintendo basically spelled out the fact that emulation can be used legally and it can be used illegally depending on how it's actually done, and that is definitely not something that Nintendo PR probably wanted them to say, and I'm sure they're not exactly stoked this information got out, because again, they've gone through and basically destroyed every single Switch emulator out there. Of course, they still exist. I understand that is a thing. Nothing ever is deleted from the actual internet, so you can grab these things and still continue to play them. But as far as active development on any sort of Switch emulator right now, if it's actually happening whatsoever, it's definitely behind the scenes and in the shadows, and that's exactly what Nintendo wants, to remove easy access to emulation options. And they talk about the fact that they don't like flash carts, mod chips, etc., and that is totally fine. But again, there probably would be a use case for something like a flash cart. Maybe you have a 12-year-old kid who wants to take his entire 3DS or Switch library along on vacation, and you know full well he's going to lose those things, so you put the 12 games he owns onto that cart and he can play them to his heart's content. You purchase the console, you purchase the cartridges, you do have the legal right to play them however you want. But of course that is the edge case, and I will readily admit that most of the buyers of these devices are not doing it that way, so you can understand how Nintendo would take umbrance with a situation like that. And even if I hit Nintendo all the time about their ridiculous lawsuits and all of the different things they do as far as emulation and trying to kill it are concerned, I give them this one because I am a reasonable person, and that really is the fact and case, that they are used sometimes for things that shouldn't be used for. But they talk about what a software emulator is, how it copies games, and how it can disable the security on certain devices. That's what they talk about with that technological prevention measure, and they're basically saying a Switch emulator would be legal, but you can't bypass the actual protections in the emulator. So if you had a Switch cart reader and it plugged into the emulator and read that security code, Nintendo is saying, go ahead, it's totally fine because you're not bypassing anything. So maybe a Switch or Switch 2 emulator should just have a USB cart reader so you can plug it in, the emulator can read the security key off the copy of the game you bought and emulate it, because based on Nintendo's own rules that would be fine. But again, there is a very big reason why they don't want to see the inside of a court case here, because when they talk about violations regarding circumvention of technological measures in the DMCA, they say you're not allowed to do it until you actually scroll down a little bit, and then they say, but you can actually totally do it, it's cool with us if you're doing something like research, which is a very broad term that anyone could basically state. And it all comes down to, again, the fact that your Switch has a key and every single cartridge has a key. Those two keys basically communicate with each other. They perform a handshake or unlocking of that lock, and it allows the executable on that game cart to be read and executed from the actual Switch in and of itself. You need these two keys to talk to each other, you need them to authorize the software, and then everything will boot as normal. And in the Yuzu lawsuit, they talk about the fact that this was circumvented in the emulator. But if you actually scroll down a little bit more into this particular provision on the DMCA, it allows you to bypass those exact protections if you're reverse engineering the hardware and you're trying to get interoperability of software on a different platform. And that is the reality of why Nintendo doesn't actually want to have a case decided. A judge could read this and say you are allowed to do it because the people creating the emulator are doing research and reverse engineering, which is exactly what they're doing. If you ever wondered how old the DMCA really is, it defines things like analog video cassette recorders, analog video cassette camcorders, and all sorts of other things like VHS and even phonographic records. To say that this law does not keep up with our modern technology would be an understatement. This is a dinosaur that continues to roam the world, affecting everything, and it is a law that should be addressed hopefully sometime soon in the future, because the Nintendo Switch in front of you has absolutely nothing to do with the technology that we had at the turn of the millennium. We had Dreamcast and that was great, but it's one of those things. Technology has marched on where the law has stayed stagnant the entire time. Nintendo also talks about the fact that home screens or menus could be subject to copyright protection. So if you want to make a new Nintendo emulator, just have it in a black screen, go ahead and boot the game from a game cartridge and have it jump right into the software. You would then be totally fine in Nintendo's eyes. So what Nintendo is saying right now is there is a legal path to emulation moving forward, especially on Switch 2. Now that's what they say, it might not be what they do, but envision this future. You have a Nintendo Switch 2 emulator that only works if you plug your cartridge in via a USB cart reader, and that cartridge supplies the key to the emulator. Therefore, you are not bypassing the technological prevention measure, you're doing it exactly as Nintendo wants you to do, you're just not doing it on the hardware that they sold you. That again would be perfectly legal according to what the representative from Nintendo said at this event in Japan. And I'm pretty sure maybe most of Nintendo didn't want him to say that. But Nintendo realizes they're fighting an uphill battle here. They cannot stop emulation, they just look for emulation creators that violate other stupid things like providing information on how to play pre-release games on the emulator or supplying files they shouldn't. Nintendo depends on people not being versed in the law and committing different quote-unquote sins that would allow Nintendo to go after them and shut them down for some other reason, like the developers of Yuzu Tropic Haze did. And that is the reality of this. Switch 2 is coming. It's been announced, and Nintendo's going to continue to go after emulation, but they basically left the door open and cracked because they know if they go to court and they lose this argument, then emulation would be completely blown open, and that's something they don't want to have. It is a cat-mouse game. The emulation creators are the mouse. Nintendo is the cat, and the cat just basically told the mouse, if you just stay over here in this corner and don't bother me, I probably won't try to eat you. That's the best way I can describe it. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below, but apparently emulation is legal. We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.